You already know. You know that one bad performance review doesn't mean you're incompetent. You know that being rejected once doesn't mean you're unlovable. You know that forgetting to reply to an email for 3 days doesn't make you a terrible person. You have reasoned your way through this. You can explain, clearly and calmly, why the catastrophic interpretation is wrong. And then, the feeling arrives anyway. The shame, the spiral, the 3-hour loop of replaying what you should have said, the knowledge that you are overreacting happening simultaneously with the overreaction itself. Albert Ellis spent 50 years explaining why this happens, and his answer is one of the most uncomfortable things in psychology. Knowing something is irrational doesn't make it stop. Because the problem was never the thought, the problem was what you were demanding underneath it. Ellis was born in Pittsburgh in 1913. He grew up in a home he described as emotionally neglected. His father was frequently absent, his mother was largely indifferent, and he was left, as a child, to figure out most things on his own. He developed what he later called a natural inclination toward philosophizing, thinking very hard about what was actually making him upset and what he could do about it. By the time he became a psychologist, he had already worked through several of his own fears, using himself as the experiment. He was terrified of public speaking. He was terrified of approaching women he was attracted to. He knew, in both cases, that the fear was not proportionate. He could identify the irrational beliefs underneath, that he would be humiliated if he stumbled, that rejection would be catastrophic, that he could not stand the discomfort. He could see them clearly. They did not stop. So he decided to do something that was not, at the time, standard psychological advice. He went to the Bronx Botanical Garden for 30 consecutive days and forced himself to start conversations with 100 women sitting alone on benches. Not because he stopped being afraid, because he kept going despite being afraid, until the belief that rejection would be catastrophic ran out of confirming evidence. 100 conversations, 30 days, no catastrophe. The belief had nothing left to feed on. This is the core of what became rational emotive behavior therapy, not just identifying irrational beliefs, but understanding what makes them persist and what actually changes them. Ellis talked to 100 strangers in a botanical garden because he understood something most people don't. Knowing a belief is irrational doesn't make it lose its grip. You have to deprive it of what it feeds on. Think about something you know rationally, clearly is not as catastrophic as it feels. Something you've explained to yourself 100 times. And it still produces the same reaction. Leave it in the comments, even just one line, because there's almost certainly someone else reading who has been circling the exact same thing. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind, not to think better thoughts, because understanding what's actually running underneath your thoughts is a different project entirely. Here is the gap that Ellis kept returning to. Most of us have been taught that emotional disturbance comes from events. Something bad happens and we feel bad. That's the intuitive model. Event causes feeling. Ellis argued that this is wrong, or at least radically incomplete. The same event produces wildly different emotional responses in different people and in the same person at different times. An audience laughs at something you say in a meeting. One person feels mortified. Another feels delighted. Another feels nothing in particular. Same event, 3 completely different emotional responses. Which means the event didn't cause the response. Something in the middle did. He called it the belief. And not just any belief, a specific kind. The kind that includes a demand. The difference between a preference and a demand is the difference between "I would really like to do well at this presentation" and "I must do well at this presentation, and if I don't, it will be awful, and I will not be able to stand it, and it will prove that I am fundamentally not good enough." The first is uncomfortable, but manageable. You prepare, you do your best. You accept that it might not be perfect. The second turns the presentation into a referendum on your value as a person. The stakes are no longer the presentation. The stakes are everything. Ellis mapped this out with a model he called the ABC. A is the activating event. Something happens. Your boss gives you critical feedback. A relationship ends. You make a mistake in front of people. C is the consequence, the emotional and behavioral response. You feel devastated, or furious, or paralyzed, or defensive. Most people assume A causes C. The feedback causes the devastation. The rejection causes the despair. This is what it feels like. But Ellis placed B between them, beliefs. And he was very specific about what kind of beliefs create the most destructive emotional consequences. They are not beliefs that are simply negative or pessimistic. They are beliefs that contain absolute demands, words like must, should, have to, ought, beliefs that something is not just bad, but catastrophic, unbearable, the worst thing that could happen. I must be approved of by everyone who matters to me, or it proves I am worthless. I must be competent in everything I undertake, or I am a failure. Life must be fair to me, or it is unbearable. These are not logical beliefs. Most people know they are not logical, but they function like axioms, unexamined premises that the whole emotional architecture is built on. You don't feel them as beliefs. You feel them as facts about the world. So why doesn't knowing they are irrational make them stop? This is the part that most self-help accounts skip. They tell you to identify your irrational thoughts, challenge them, replace them with more rational ones. And this can help, sometimes, with the surface content. But the belief that is actually driving the emotional response is usually not at the surface. When you feel devastated after receiving criticism, the surface thought might be, I always mess things up. You can challenge that. You can find counter evidence. You can remind yourself of all the times you did well. But underneath that thought, running much deeper and much less accessible to direct challenge, is usually something more like, I must be seen as competent, and if I am not, something terrible will have been confirmed about who I am. That belief is not a thought you're having about the event. It is a lens you are looking through. It shapes what the event means before you've consciously processed it. By the time you get to the surface, thought I always mess things up, the damage is already done. The lens has already interpreted the feedback as confirmation of the demand not being met. Disputing the surface thought is like replacing a word in a sentence while leaving the grammar intact. The sentence still works the same way. You need to change the underlying structure, not just the content. And changing the underlying structure is harder. It requires something more than thinking. It requires experience that contradicts the demand directly. Ellis had a name for the mechanism at the center of all this. He called it musturbation. He meant it precisely, the compulsive, automatic conversion of a want into an absolute must. The transformation of a preference I would really like to be approved of into a demand I must be approved of, and the transformation of a demand into a catastrophe when it isn't met, and if I'm not, it is awful, unbearable, a confirmation of something fundamental about me. The 3 steps happen so fast and so automatically that by the time the emotion arrives, you are not aware of having moved through any of them. You experience the end result, the devastation, the rage, the shame, as if it were a direct response to the event, but it passed through the full machinery of the demand on the way there. Ellis identified 3 core musts that he thought underlay most human emotional disturbance. First, I must perform well and win approval, or else I am a worthless person. Second, you must treat me fairly and considerately, or you are a terrible person who deserves punishment. Third, my life must be comfortable and rewarding, or it is awful and I cannot bear it. Most people, if you ask them directly, would not endorse these as their beliefs. They would say, "Of course I don't think I have to be perfect. Of course I understand people aren't always going to treat me fairly. Of course I know life is sometimes difficult." But watch what happens when the demand is violated. Watch the intensity of the reaction. That intensity is the signature of the must. The second part of the machinery is what Ellis called awfulizing. When a demand is not met, the mind doesn't stop at, "This is bad." It moves immediately to, "This is awful." Awful, in Ellis's very precise usage, means worse than it could possibly be. More than 100% bad, not just very unpleasant, categorically unendurable. This is not a conscious choice. It happens automatically, as a direct extension of the must. If something must happen and it doesn't, the mind immediately reaches for the most catastrophic interpretation available. Because that's how the must thinks. If this mattered enough that it had to happen, then its not happening must be the worst possible outcome. The result is that normal negative experiences get amplified. Criticism is not just unpleasant feedback, it is devastating confirmation. Rejection is not just disappointment, it is proof of something unfixable. A mistake is not just an error, it is evidence. The awfulizing is the thing that makes the experience feel like a crisis when it is not a crisis. And because it feels like a crisis, the mind behaves like one is happening. All the cognitive narrowing, all the threat response activation, all the difficulty thinking clearly, even though the actual situation doesn't warrant any of that. The third part is what Ellis called low frustration tolerance, or, more pointedly, what he sometimes called I-Can't-Stand-It-Itis. This is the belief that the discomfort created by the unmet demand is unbearable, that you literally cannot tolerate the feeling, that the anxiety or shame or rejection or disappointment is too much to experience. The irony Ellis kept pointing out is that this belief is almost always factually wrong. You are, in almost all cases, capable of standing what you believe you cannot stand. The discomfort is real. The incapacity is not, but the belief that you cannot stand it creates the behavior of someone who cannot stand it. Avoidance, escape, distraction, the compulsive search for relief. And avoidance is the thing that keeps the must alive. Because if you never encounter the thing the must is protecting against, the must never gets updated. The belief that criticism confirms your worthlessness stays intact because you arrange your life to avoid criticism. The belief that rejection is catastrophic stays intact because you don't put yourself in positions where rejection is possible. The must never runs out of confirming evidence because it never has to face disconfirming evidence. Ellis's month in the Botanical Garden was a direct assault on I-Can't-Stand-It-Itis. He was proving, with his own experience, that he could stand it, not comfortably, not without discomfort, but stand it he could. And once you know you can stand something, the demand that it not happen loses its most important weapon. Ellis was not gentle about what the way through required. He did not think that understanding the belief was sufficient. He did not think that talking about it was sufficient. He thought that people needed to actively, deliberately, and persistently dispute the demand itself and then expose themselves to the thing the demand was protecting against. Disputing means asking very specific questions about the demand. Not, "Is this thought negative?" but, "Where is the evidence that I must be approved of by everyone? What law of the universe states that I have to be competent at everything? Why is it literally unbearable when something goes wrong?" These questions sound obvious when written down. The demand has an answer for all of them. It says, I don't have to have evidence. I just know that I must. This is what makes the must so persistent. It is not vulnerable to logical argument in the way a factual claim would be. It is a demand, not a description. You can't disprove a demand with evidence. What you can do is dispute its logic. Demanding something that reality has not promised you is irrational, in the specific sense that it leads to emotional consequences that don't serve you and that are not warranted by what actually happened. And then crucially, you expose yourself to the thing the must has been protecting you from. Not because the discomfort disappears, but because you discover that you can tolerate the discomfort. That the criticism did not confirm your worthlessness. That the rejection was not catastrophic. That you can stand the thing you were certain you could not stand. Each encounter with disconfirming evidence weakens the demand slightly, not dramatically, not all at once, but the must depends on never being tested. Once it is tested regularly, it becomes, over time, a preference, and preferences are livable. Ellis's practical contribution was this: there is a specific question you can learn to ask in the moment when the emotional response is strongest. Not, is this thought true? That question is too easy to argue with. The must has a comeback for everything. The question is, where is the must? What am I demanding here, underneath what I'm feeling? And is that demand in fact necessary? Or is it something I have been carrying so long it has started to feel like the nature of things? You won't be able to do this in the middle of the strongest emotional reaction. Ellis was realistic about this. When the spiral is already happening, cognitive access is limited. The time to ask the question is before the spiral is fully developed in the first few moments of discomfort, before the awfulizing has completed its work. Or, alternatively, after, when the intensity is past and you can sit with what happened with some distance. What was the event? What was the feeling? And between them, what was the demand? The more you can identify the demand, the less power it has to operate invisibly. It does not lose its power the moment you name it, but named things are, at least, visible. And visible things can be questioned. And questioned demands, when they are forced to produce their evidence, almost never can. Albert Ellis died in 2007 at the age of 93, working nearly until the end. He was famously blunt, famously impatient, and famously direct in a way that made some people deeply uncomfortable and others feel, for the first time, that someone was actually taking their problems seriously enough to be honest about them. He was not interested in making people feel understood. He was interested in making them feel better, and he believed those were different projects. Understanding what made you miserable was the beginning. Changing the structure underneath was the work. What he kept returning to, in 50 years of writing and clinical work, was the same observation. Human beings suffer unnecessarily, not because life is not genuinely difficult, it often is, but because the difficulty gets amplified, transformed, made categorically unbearable by the machinery of the must. And the must is not who you are. It is something you learn to do, something that once served a purpose and continued past its usefulness. Something that, with enough patient examination and enough willingness to test it, can become something smaller and more manageable. Not a demand, just a preference. And you can live with a preference. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Think deeper. Live clearer.